This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted on the 1st of September, 1971. The interview was conducted by Barbara Richardville. The interviewee is Mr. Frank Galbreath, and that's Galbreath, of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on the 20th of June, 1986, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener. The recording of this interview begins in mid-sentence. There is no introduction, no identification, or any sign-off on this tape. The index sheets give the date and the interviewer's name. There is no indication that the beginning of this interview exists anywhere else in the Living Legends collection.
But the Sioux Bland number 1, drilled by Wyrick or Wick, I've forgotten what his name actually was, caused a lot of excitement and this would be in the latter part of June 1901. And Dad and Charles Francis Colcord of Oklahoma City were in the real estate business at that time in Oklahoma City, but like people coming from all over the country, at the news of this first well, they came over, hired a special car and came over in a special train from Oklahoma City the next day. And they saw the little well, it was drilled about 600 feet, and I may be mistaken about this, but I think that historians give it as approximately a barrel of oil and about a good pocket of gas. But it was enough to start oil activity. So Dad and Mr. Colcord and C.K. Jones, who was very active in building the Frisco Railroad, had been, and at that time, later he built the Frisco into Oklahoma City, and may I say that on this as I'm telling it, I'm just and Mr. C.K. Jones and Usher Carson, and I have a list of people that I don't remember too many of them, but they went together and they formed the Red Fork Land and Development Company. Now, that was in the fall of 1901. They drilled either the second or the third well in Red Fork, and then in 1902, shortly, and I think it was 1902, shortly after the town site was open for development, Dad drilled the first well on the town site of Red Fork, and he got a very nice gas well, which he later incorporated, and among other wells, into the Galbreath Oil and Gas Company. But all of these wells were small, and they were always cheap, and no one made any money out of it, actually.
Frank, what do you mean? What do you mean by oil was cheap?
Well, at that time it was in 1909 it was 32 cents. Now I'll give you a good example of it. In about 1905, Jim O'Neill of the Prairie Oil and Gas Company had come to Tulsa from Independence, Kansas, because Dad had drilled some wells in the Red Fork field, and had gotten a well that made about 150 barrels. Jim O'Neill of the Prairie came down, and at that time the going price of oil was above $1, and on the strength of just this one well, O'Neill went back to Independence, and they cut the price of oil from around $1, a little above that, down 50 cents a barrel. And Dad always laughed and said that he was the one that originally broke the market in overproduction on a 150-barrel well. So oil fluctuated from 52 cents and from 50 cents on up. And I know in 1913 it was only 88 cents. And then your war in Europe began, the war clouds began gathering, and people began to realize that were going to need a lot of petroleum, and it gradually increased to where during the war there, oil ran above $3 a barrel. Yeah, that's World War One. So I haven't gotten to the Glen Pool, but all that time, oil was around 50 cents or lower. So when you got into your overproduction of the Glen Pool, why, there were just one or two small pipelines. And Texaco hadn't started their big line, their terminal line, and Sinclair hadn't started their big line. In fact, it was just a question of, as J.R. Mannion used to tell a story, he was the chief gauger, he was the superintendent for Prairie Pipeline Company. He said that the gaugers used to go by on a full tank of oil there, and if there wasn't a $10 bill tied to the stopcock, why they didn't get their oil run. And I don't doubt it, because that was simply a case of overproduction until the facilities weren't there to run them in, and there were no refineries at this time. But to get back to this Red Fork situation, no one had made any money over there, and Mr. Concord, and Mr. Jones, and Usher Carson, and all of Dad's associates, they had gone on back to Oklahoma City. So Dad, he spent most of his time between Red Fork and the oil business, and but he spent most of his time at Red Fork in these little wells he had, and he spent more time there than he did with his real estate holdings with Concord, Galbreath, and Shelley, which was one of the main real estate concerns in Oklahoma City, and they had laid out, I think Delmar Garden and some of the old-time places there. But anyway, Dad was doing so much commuting that we finally moved from Oklahoma City in 1904, and first we rented the old Clinton place. And I have pictures of that. But anyway, to get on to the Glen Pool, Dad made on one of the wolf hunts that he used to go on down there, Dad made the acquaintance of Bob Glenn, whose wife was Crete Malati, and they arranged to drill this was in July of 1905, and they arranged to drill a well on the Glen allotment. And at this time, Frank Chesley was producing a little Red Fork well, and Dad was pumping it off of his power. And Dad was very much impressed by Chesley. He said that he was a go-getter, he was a good leash man, and he was very active. He met people well. So he got Chesley interested in going down there, and he showed him a few of the outcroppings there that had a few nodules of oil. And make a long story short, they arranged to drill the Glen number 1. And at this time, Roy Dodd who has had some tools. He and his brothers had been doing some work in the Red Fork field. At this time, Dad approached Roy with the idea of contracting the well, and Roy remarked to the effect that he didn't want to take a chance on that, but he would sell Dad the string of tools. And Dad said, well, he said, you know, no one's made any money in oil here. And he said, right now, he said, I don't know, $1,500 is a lot of money. And Roy said, well, Bob, he said, tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll take $1,500 and I'll just take your note for it and you can pay me when you can. And the funny part about that situation was that he sold Dad the string of tools for $1,500, and then he went to work for him as a head driller on the Glen No. 1. I think at $5 a day. And subsequently, he ran tools there, and he made quite a bit of money himself in the Glen Pool. But Dad and Frank Chesley leased the Glen allotment, and went in, drilled the original well, came in early morning of November 22nd, 1905. And it caused some comment, and in fact it caused quite a bit of excitement. But the Red Fork play had kind of cooled off. The play around Cleveland, there'd been some oil, but it wasn't anything startling. And the Johnstone well in Bartlesville, 1897, had caused some comment, but it has all cooled off. So really, the Glen No. 1 partly brought a thinking of, well, we'll just wait and see what happens next. Well, the second well Dad and Chesley drilled was to the east, and it proved to be the east edge of the field, and it was a dry hole. And I think, I think I'm right, but Dad drilled about 100 wells down there, and that was the only dry hole that he ever got in Glen Pool. Then he drilled the third well, and this would be in the early part of 1906, and it made about 2,000 barrels. And then that's when things really cut loose, and that's when people from all over the United States, that's when they began coming into Tulsa and coming into Sapulpa and Red Fork. And Sapulpa and Red Fork not only didn't have too many facilities for handling the oil crowd, but they just weren't as alert and as anxious to get the oil play as Tulsa was. And Tulsa just started, and they never looked back from then on.
Tell me what they did with this oil. They didn't have a pipeline.
Well, at that time, now I stand to be corrected on this, but and I would have to check some of my factually, I'd have to check some of my history. But the Texas company and had in 1906 had and I may be mistaken about the date, but about 1906, the Texas company had a little 2-inch line, but they had started their big line from Port Arthur, Texas, up here. And Sinclair had started one. And then I don't remember when the old Pierce Corporation came in, but there were so many wells being drilled that it wasn't a question of production. Those wells came in for 1,500 feet. They made tremendous flows, but it was a question of pipeline facilities. And it was just a question of whoever could get their oil run. And as I said, the gaugers, they could take so much oil, and there was always a little under-the-table dealing on the deal. So it was, I know that Dad had, he was oil poor. Dad had 20,000 barrels actual production, and he had a potential flow. He told me at one time, he said, with good luck, that he could have kicked his production up to 100,000 barrels a day. But it was going into his actual flow of 20,000 barrels was going into earthen storage, and they'd start building steel tanks, but Dad at one time had approximately 1 million barrels of oil in just earthen storage, just trying to BS, the basic sediment. So he was oil poor, and he bought a site close to where the old Constantine refinery was, and he was going to put in his own refinery. And about that time, now this was in the days before the Corporation Commission, of course, and but Dad was oil poor, and he was going to run his own oil up to West Tulsa and refine it. And then the legislature passed what was called the Strain-Yager bill, which made all pipelines the common carrier. And anytime you crossed the section line, well, you were automatically a common carrier, and you had to take pro rata of the other guy's oil. Well, that just simply put Dad between a rock and a hard place. So they had so much oil that they just ran what they could, put the other in storage, and sold it at a sacrifice. And I doubt if Dad ever got as much as $1 a barrel for oil. Later on, as time progressed towards World War I, why oil began going up. And I noticed by this Oklahoma Booster magazine that oil was, in 1909, sold for 38 cents, and 1913 it sold for 88 cents. And I would say in the next 3 or 4 years we would see oil selling above $3 a barrel.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone from all over the United States came down and got in the oil business. It was and the oil men were they were a breed of men all their own. They were a separate individual breed. They were individualists, and they stuck together too. I remember one instance of the generosity of this breed of men. C.W. Barnes was drilling at Muskogee, was drilling a well a mile or so below one of Dad's leases, and it was sort of semi-wildcat territory, and they didn't know too much about it. One evening he drove in his rig, drove by Dad's one of Dad's leases, and called Dad out to the rig, and he said, "Bob," he said, "you know how well I've been drilling down below here?" And he said, "Well, I want to tell you," he said, "I've got a tremendous well." And he said, "If you hurry and get down there," he said, "I'll tell you where there's a good lease you can pick up." Well, now, he said, "Bob, I have all the leases I can handle." Dad said, "Well," he said, "Barnes," he said, "I'm in the same shape you are, but I appreciate it." And he said, "Well, I'll tell somebody else about it." In other words, that man was just practically offering Dad a gift of $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, that was their breed. They either liked each other and stuck together, or they just fought each other from hell to breakfast. And because the Standard Oil had come in at that time, and it's too long to go into it. Dad fought him all of his life, and naturally, being his son, I can understand why he did it, and I'm very proud that he did do it. but it cost him a lot of money. But at the same time, it's water under the bridge.
Frank, what's your first recollection of Tulsa?
My first recollection of Tulsa is when I was just a very small boy riding over from Red Fork to Tulsa with the Bonnickers. He was associated. He was one of the prominent citizens of Red Fork, and he was also associated with Dad in some of those Red Fork wells. And driving over in a team and buggy, we'd come over and do some shopping. Come over with folks, leave real early in the morning, and do what shopping we had to do, and drive back late that night. It was a long drive, and Tulsa and Red Fork, there wasn't too much difference in the size of the towns at that time. And
This is about when?
that would be approximately in 1905, 1906. I'd have only been about 4 years old, because we'd shortly moved to Tulsa from Red Fork.
Mm-hmm.
But I just vague remembrances. But then, actually, my first complete remembrances is starting in kindergarten in the old Brock and Elliott school here. It was a kindergarten, and it started out as a kindergarten classes, and then later on it became a private school. But I was in kindergarten there, and then I went into the first grade in the old Central High School. I was, and then I finished. I was in the last graduating class that had gone to the old Central High School. But my first remembrances are possibly of the old, the first grade classes, and so in the first grade I would have been, that would have been 1908, and at that time I remember when the new Boston Avenue Church was built and dedicated, and our Sunday school class was taught by Mr. Rollins and Rex Evans and Glen Pool and I don't recall. I'd have to give it some thought. Who else? And that would be the Boston Avenue, the old Boston Avenue Church where the Philcade is now, or whatever you call it. But well, at that time, that was in 1908, and if I remember, this is partly hearsay and partly some of the folks talking, but at that time, I think there were 5 cars in town, and we had one of the very first automobiles. We either had the second or third automobile. It was a Pope Toledo, and I had thought that we had the first car, but I was talking with my brother one time, and he said he knew that we didn't have the first car because the first car was an old homemade affair that with a planetary shift that you showed the gear forward, and it went forward, and he pulled it back, and it went in reverse, and he said he knew that because he was experimenting with it and ran through somebody's garage, the barn door one time. But we had, then in 1908, I think there were 5 automobiles, or 1907 or 8, there were 5 automobiles in Tulsa, but there was a tremendous influx of cars starting about that time because there was a lot of oil money beginning to come into Tulsa, and they were realizing that what a market for things that Tulsa was. But we had, Dad and Mr. Calcord had, Dad had so much oil business that he and Mr. Calcord had dissolved partnership in around 1908, and their holdings over there and some of their buildings. And I know in the outcome of it. Mr. Colcord had the old Franklin Agency at Oklahoma City, and part of it was that we took a 1908 Franklin, and then we had a 1908 or 1909 Winton, which I have pictures of. So we had been living in Red Fork up 1904 and 1905, and in the latter part of 1905 we moved to Tulsa, and we moved to 312 South Denver, which is where the new post office, the new federal building is. And I know our neighbors on the north were the Annals and the Arthurs, and the Wickeisers lived on Elwood back of us north, and the Stravells back of us on Elwood on 4th and Elwood, and the Prices lived on the southwest corner of 4th and Elwood, and Dr. Webb lived across the street from us on Denver. The Thurmans lived north of us. The Myers lived north of us, and that was, at that time, that was one of the main parts of town. Tulsa was a very small place, but we lived there up until approximately latter part of 1909, and the folks were building the big house out on 13th and Boulder. So we moved to the Brady Hotel, and if I remember correctly, we lived there part of 1909 and part of 1910 while our new house was being built. And we had moved, but at the time we moved to the Brady Hotel, the old Alcorn Hotel was one of the better hotels, but it was sort of a commercial hotel. And the old Robertson Hotel and the Brady Hotel were the two leading hostelries of Tulsa at that time. And Mr. Brady, Tate Brady, at this time was Democratic National Committeeman. So naturally, any of the Democratic happenings were usually gathered. The gathering was at the Brady Hotel. Now in 1910, I would have been 8 years old. So a lot of the happenings, political happenings, naturally would be tales that I'd heard and clippings that I have from old newspaper records. But to get on to the state capitol scene and the moving of the capital from Guthrie to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma was made a state in November 1907, and Charles N. Haskell was our first governor, and on June the 11th, 1910, the vote was cast by the people of the state of Oklahoma on to where the state capital should be. At this time, it was in Guthrie, and the old Enabling Act had proposed that it be there until 1913, but there was a lot of political maneuvering on this, and Haskell had taken it to the people on a vote. On June 11th, it so happened that Governor Haskell had made a talk in Broken Arrow in the afternoon, and he was talking at the old Opera House on East 2nd Street in the evening. And by evening, they had begun to get a result of the election results on where the capital would be, and it favored Oklahoma City approximately 3-1. And these are approximate figures, but I think that it eventually there was about 92,000 people for Oklahoma City for capital, and about 31,000 for and these are approximate figures, but I think that it eventually there was about 92,000 people for Oklahoma City for capital, and about 31,000 for Guthrie for the state capital, and about 8,000 for Shawnee. And if I remember correctly, I think Governor Haskell himself had voted for Shawnee, but then he was simply leaving it to the people. But there had been so many maneuverings and injunctions that he had proposed that it be moved to Oklahoma City immediately. But when the results of the election came out, and it became evident Oklahoma City was going to be the permanent capital, why some of the residents of Guthrie had secured a temporary injunction, and phone call came that they were coming to Tulsa in a special train to serve the papers on Governor Haskell to keep from the removal from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. And then another report came out that inasmuch as he was going on the Katy that night to Oklahoma City, that they would wait for him at Osage Junction and serve the injunction papers on him there. But Haskell was a lot smarter. One of the reasons he had set this thing up for June 11th was because it was on Saturday, and it was one of the very few times we ever had election in Oklahoma on Saturday. So, but they had gotten a temporary injunction, but the idea was that they couldn't have gone in on Sunday. Whether they got the injunction, I don't know. But anyway, the upshot of it was that all the group down at the Brady Hotel had decided that instead of taking the Katy, they would just beat the Guthrie'ites to the punch, and they chartered a special train out of the Frisco Yard here in Tulsa. And I know Dad was, as Judge Branson in Muskogee, Judge Fred P. Branson recalled, said he had, in an interview one time, said he had been in his room at the Robinson Hotel, and he was awakened by a call from Haskell, and asked to come to Brady Hotel. Said when he got to the lobby of the Brady Hotel, while Governor Haskell was standing on the mezzanine floor at a wall telephone. And said, I heard Governor Haskell say to his secretary, Bill Anthony, said, Bill, this is Haskell, and I've been phoning over the state and find that Oklahoma City has won the capital fight. And said, get Bill Cross, who was Secretary of State, and go up to the Logan County Courthouse and get the seal of the state and bring it to Oklahoma City and meet me there in the morning by 7:30. He says, and don't fail to get the seal, Bill, and bring it to Oklahoma City. So the ones that were made up this party were, besides Judge Branson, was Mr. and Mrs. Brady, and Dad and Mother, that'd be Robert and Mrs. Galbreath, and L.J. Martin, John O. Mitchell, and Colonel Stryker, and Gabe Bright, and Bob Lozier, and there were two or three others that that I don't recall at this time. But anyway, they had this special train. Dad chartered a special train, or anyway, he paid for it. And the next morning, next morning they pulled into Oklahoma City early, and the CO with Anthony, and I think that the Light was the driver, was waiting for them at the old Lee Hotel, which was subsequently the Lee Huckins. So first thing that they did when they went in, they met him with the SEAL, met Anthony, and he had driven 30 miles with the SEAL, which he had sneaked out of the Capitol at Guthrie, and so they had. He had taken. Anthony had met. Anthony had met Earl Keyes of the Secretary of State's office, and Cross, who was Secretary of State, had told Keyes to that he was sending a note by Bill Anthony, the governor's secretary, and for Keyes to do what the note requested him to do. So he turned the SEAL over to Anthony, and it was about a 30-mile drive into Oklahoma City, and he drove that night, the night of the 11th and the morning of the 12th, and got there in time to meet our party from Tulsa, meet the Capitol, and so he had the SEAL, and it was wrapped up in a piece of brown craft wrapping paper, and but when the governor's train pulled into Oklahoma City, a messenger shouted and says, "Well, Anthony is here with the SEAL, and he's safe and sound." So one of the amusing incidents, the latter part of it, but one of the sidelights of the latter part of this, all the party was in the lobby of the old Lee Hotel, and someone says, "Well, we're all hungry, let's go in and get our breakfast." And they all started into a restaurant to eat. Governor Haskell says, "Well, wait just a moment." So he stepped up to the clerk's desk and got a sheet of paper with the with the old hotel letterhead, and he wrote the official proclamation based on the returns of the election, and declaring Oklahoma City the capital of the state per the law, as the law prescribed it, and he published it, placed it in a public place according to law, and he put his official signature on it and the seal, and it was posted on the wall of the old Lee Huckins Hotel. And then he says, "Well, now that's done," he says, "I'm ready to have breakfast in the state capitol." That's it.
Now,
Well, as I said a while ago, Tate Brady was the first Democratic National Committeeman, and Dad was the second. He defeated Brady in a very hot battle in the, I believe it would be the latter part of 1911. It'd be, Dad was elected Democratic National Committeeman in 1912. And this was the year when Woodrow Wilson had been nominated and had been elected President of the United States. And Dad, while he was originally a supporter of Champ Clark's, he had decided to support Wilson and had put quite a bit of money into Wilson's campaign. And incidentally, this is just a little sidelight that I'd rather not be used because it's just a little tale. But Dad could have been Secretary of the Interior under Wilson had he wanted it, but Dad had so much business and unfinished law business that he was spending too much time in politics as it was. But anyway, in 1912, Dad ran a special train, a booster train, to Washington, and he was always Oklahoma's #1 fan. He was the #1 fan, booster. So on this special train, they call it the Oklahoma Booster, Dad had they set up in one of the cars, they set up a printing press, and they printed a paper. As I say, it was called the Oklahoma Booster. It was published on the Oklahoma inaugural booster train en route from Tulsa to Washington, D.C. J. Burr Gibbons was editor. Preston McGoodwin was associate editor. Harry Kinsey was the foreman of the paper. And the managers of the train were the Honorable Robert Galbreath and the Honorable Robert Gillum. And they had quite a time. They made stops at various places along the line. Pittsburgh, they stopped at Newark, Ohio. They stopped at Cincinnati, where Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce presented the train with a big loving cup, and I still have that at home. And then they went on to Columbus, Ohio, and they went on to Mount Sterling, which was Dad's home place, and the whole town turned out to welcome him. But then they went on up to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. And at that time, that was at Wilson's first inauguration.
There is no sign-off for this interview. It simply concludes at the end of Mr. Galbraith's story. There is no indication that this material is continued on this tape or on any other Living Legend tape. We have copied this material exactly the way it appears on the original Living Legend master tape.